welcome. Welcome to Oxford. Welcome to the Internet Politics and Policy Conference. If anybody doesn't think that's the conference they're at, then now's the time to leave. I'm Helen Margetts. I'm a professor in the Oxford Internet Institute, a department of the University of Oxford, and I'm the overall academic convener of the conference. It's really good to see you all there, all here. I'm just going to say a few words of welcome and a few logistical details, and then hand over to our first keynote speaker, Arthur Lupia. So why are we all here? I just give you my quick perspective of that, although everybody does things for different reasons. I'm sure there's lots of reasons why you're all here. But I hope that one of the reasons we're all here is because we share some things. First and most obviously, a belief that the internet plays a central, a crucial, an important role in contemporary policy making and political life. And that second, we're all of us in some way involved in an endeavour to understand the dynamics of that role, to understand, to go beyond just a kind of belief or an idea that the internet is somehow important or makes a difference. And because we're all involved in an endeavour like that, that means we share some things which makes it good for us all to be in the same place every now and then. It means we share the same excitement. I mean, I think it would be fair to say that the internet is a reasonably hot topic. I don't know about you, but when people ask me what I do and I tell them, they don't say, oh gosh, that sounds boring, or immediately move away, although they may do so later when I go into detail. So it's exciting, but it's also challenging. There's lots of reasons why studying some aspect of policy making or political life on the internet is challenging. There's the possibility of all the data that can be generated from the data, data that as social scientists we may never have had before. At the same time, collecting that data and analysing it can be a complex technological and methodological task. The internet kind of forces methodological innovation on us. It facilitates methodological innovation, but it also means we have to do it. And it also requires theoretical development. It challenges some of the assumptions and micro foundations of social sciences and other disciplines. So that's my perspective on why we're all here together. Those are also the reasons why 2 years ago we took the decision to fund this journal, Policy and Internet, to give researchers a place to share and disseminate that new data, new methodologies, and theoretical development. And it's why we wanted to convene this conference, recognising that there's a kind of growing band of researchers with similar concerns and challenges. Some of them, many of you, I'm sure, are from different academic disciplines and are perhaps buried quite deep inside a discipline or inside a particular department from a particular perspective, rather than, like us at the Oxford Internet Institute, in a multidisciplinary institute focusing on the internet. People will come from a whole range of backgrounds. But it is still the case that internet issues tend to get slightly marginalised within disciplines. I think that's beginning to change. But we wanted to make a forum for it to be at the forefront of concern. In part, this conference came out of a realisation at the European Consortium of Political Research Conference in Potsdam last year, that internet-based issues in political science and public policy were really kind of emerging from the ghetto. There were lots of panels there, lots of researchers, many of you, I think, were there. And that makes it a real kind of a sign of maturity, I think, of this field. That's also evidenced by the enormous interest we've had in this conference. We've been constantly and persistently surprised and pleased by the interest we had in the call, by the number of submissions, by the number of papers, and the number of people who are here now or joining us tomorrow. We hope that if this goes well, that this will be a biannual event. We hope it might run every year, that the CPR conference, general conference, doesn't run. There's about 120 or 130 of you at this conference. That's actually what is known in Oxford as Dunbars Number, developed by the Oxford anthropologist Robin Dunbar, which is the theoretical cognitive limit to the number of people with whom one can maintain stable social relationships. It's about the size of most people's Christmas card list. It's supposed to be the optimal size, or the largest size you can have an office. The Swedish Tax Authority used it to design the size of their office. And incidentally, the average number of Facebook friends that people have. So I hope that that means that it's a great number for a conference as well. If it is a good number for a conference, it may seem like a small number to those of you who just got back from one of the huge conferences in September, like the American Political Science Association. But it's a big one for 1.5 days. So I do ask everyone, we've got quite a tight schedule. We've got a lot of people presenting papers and talking during that 1.5 days. So we do hope that you'll be able to keep to time. We have instructed chairs to be absolutely ruthless about that. There will be lots of time for chatting. We have no conference dinner, but we do have 2 big receptions in nice places where there'll be some food as well as drink. So we hope there'll be plenty of time for maximising the chance of forming stable social relationships. I'll just end by thanking a few organisations. I mean, first of all, of course, I just want to thank everybody in the room, particularly some of you have already submitted papers to the journal Policy and Internet, which is excellent. We hope many more of you will do so in the coming months. We'd like to thank Berkeley Electronic Press, who published the journal. They agreed with us it was a great idea to have the conference, and it was a great idea. Lots of people have submitted papers, as I said, but it meant that nobody submitted papers to us while they were all busy preparing their papers for the conference, so it has caused quite a bit of a delay for B Press, and they've been very kind about that. I'd like to thank obviously the ECPR Standing Group on Internet and Politics, and particularly Steve Ward, who is here, who joined with us in organising the conference. I'd like to thank everybody at the Oxford Internet Institute, particularly Tim Davis, our event manager, and David Sutcliffe, the managing editor of Policy and Internet, for all the work they put into the conference. Everybody who's got anything to do with organising the conference has a yellow badge, and therefore is the person to ask if you have any query at all or want to know the way somewhere. I'd like to thank the Policy Studies Organisation, and particularly the Chief Executive Professor Paul Rich, who is here, who fund the journal Policy and Internet and have sponsored various aspects of the conference. I'd also like to thank BPP and Apollo, who've sponsored other bits of the conference. In particular, the umbrellas, the orange umbrellas, which you are going to be given as a conference delegate. I'm very pleased to say they've just arrived, just as it started raining. They were supposed to, we were ordering them mainly to stop it raining. That hasn't quite worked, but it stopped us being cross with us that it is raining, or cross with Oxford. Last thing to say, I would like to just point out that the keynote lectures, just the 2, Professor Lupia's lecture and Victor Meyer-Schoenberger's lecture tomorrow, will be filmed. That means that there will be they will be webcast on the OII site at some place. If that idea horrifies you, the idea of your anonymous, well, we won't be anonymous, because if the idea of being filmed horrifies you, then please don't ask any questions, because then we'll come with a microphone and we'll try and do that. I'd like to move straight on there. I'll mention a couple of logistical details at the end, but I'd like to hand over to Arthur Lupia. Arthur is the Halverian Collegiate Professor of Political Science at the University of Michigan. And he really is a leading scholar, not just in political science, but in kind of subfields of political science, political communication, in citizen competence, deliberation. Much of his work examining how information and institutions affect policy and politics, particularly through voter competence and direct democracy. That means that much of his work is about how people make decisions when they lack information, and if the internet isn't relevant to that topic, obviously it has high relevance to that topic. He's published in all the leading political science journals and in journals in political communication and other subfields as well. And he's really one of the many reasons why it's a really great pleasure to have him here is he has a reputation for being a methodological innovator. He set up the really innovative time-shared experiments for the social scientists. He won the 2007 Innovators Award from the American Association for Public Opinion Research, and introduced a great many innovations in 5 years as a principal investigator of the American National Election Studies. So we're really pleased to have him here at this first conference. I'll hand over to you.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me here. It's a great, I love coming to Oxford. It's one of my favorite places to spend time, both to meet people and just to walk around. So we're here to assess the internet's impact on politics and policy. Over the next couple of days, I've had a chance to read through the program. I've looked at all the abstracts, and I'm looking forward to learning from all of you about the ways that the impact has occurred through both the empirical analyses that you'll present and some of the theoretical innovations that you'll propose. And so that's what you're going to do. But I want to, since you're going to do that, I want to do something different. I want to focus on something that is relevant to the internet's impact and something that I think we're all qualified to talk about. So what I want to talk about is you. What I want to assess is you. In the conference program, we're told that the internet drives social change. Okay, and that's true. But you drive the internet. Okay? And so what I want to assess for the next couple minutes is how you're doing. Are you doing as well as you can? Could you do a little better? Okay? So the way we can think about it is this is the internet. It's this shiny new thing. It looks great, and there's all kinds of new places we can imagine going with it. And it's technologically advanced, right? And it looks like a lot of fun. But still, we have to drive it. So what do I mean by you? Let me offer a definition. By you, first of all, I mean you as a practitioner. So some of you are interested in using the internet to try to accomplish socially worthy goals. And some of those could include getting people to participate in politics in new ways. Some of those could be changing policy. Some of those could be grander goals like legitimacy for democratic processes. Okay? So that's one definition of you. Or you could be a scholar who's interested in examining and helping us understand how these things work, whether the practitioners do their jobs well or badly. Okay? So, so these are the types of things we want to know. Do you do these well? Or if you study them, do you study them well? Okay? So these are the goals, and the means are, when we try to do these things, we try to change policy or increase legitimacy, that's not really what we're doing, right? I mean, these are the goals, but the means is usually we're trying to change people, okay? And I don't mean change people in terms of their views, although that can happen. We're trying to change maybe what they do. So if you're using the internet to try and increase participation, somehow you're trying to turn non-participants into participants, or people who think about politics into people who talk about politics, right? If you're trying to increase legitimacy, you're trying to take a collective action that people aren't really sure they endorse and turn it into something that maybe they feel a bit differently about. So when we talk about you trying to use the internet to change politics, we're really talking about, are you able to change beliefs, behaviors, and outcomes? And so as we assess you in the internet, that's what I want to get to. Now, we can give an overall assessment. So first I'll start by saying things that I think are obvious. In the aggregate, the internet has transformed politics and policy. Okay? And there's no point in debating that. As there is no point in debating the following, that most individual efforts to do these things fail. So in the aggregate, it's great, but most of the attempts that people have made to change policy outcomes, to increase participation, or to increase legitimacy have been abject failures. All right? So in other words, when we think about the internet, we have this great new opportunity. But the modal outcome is something quite different. All right? And it's not, it's something, I don't know how many of you have seen the movie Startup.com, but if you haven't, it's a movie about I can't remember if they're Harvard or MIT, right? But they're well-placed young men who decide that they're going to start a website that helps political participation, changes policy, increases, and that they raise some money, they get Bill Clinton to come and talk to them. It makes for a nice part of the movie. And as with most startups, within a year and a half, 2 years, it's completely bankrupt and in flames. Okay, it's back there, right? And when we look at most attempts, this is not the exception. This is the rule. Okay. Now, what I want to talk about as I assess us is for these efforts, failure is the norm, and I want to talk about those failures as being tragic. Okay. By tragic, I mean they didn't have to end this way. If we had driven the car, if we had known a little bit more about the car and how it worked, if we had known a little bit more about where we were trying to go, we wouldn't have to fail as much. Okay? So the consequences are tragic because there's something we can do about them. So in what follows, what I want to talk about are paths to failure. First, I want to talk about why it is that we drive cars off cliffs, when we try to do things with the internet. And then I want to talk about things we could change about ourselves as practitioners and also as scholars, all right, to try and make these things a little better. What I'm going to draw from is insights from a number of the social sciences, economics, psychology, political science. I'll talk a little bit about some recent streams in philosophy that are relevant at the end. But a short story is this. Sometimes we think that because our intentions are great, that our attention to detail doesn't matter. And so we think we can have folk theories about how people learn and what they pay attention to, and when we can get them to participate. We think that our good intentions plus these folk theories will lead to success. Well, actually, the folk theories that most of us carry around about how people learn or why they do what they do just don't have any evidence for them. Can't really be supported by a logic that works back to any first principles from like psychology or neurobiology. And yet there are basic things we can know about what people pay attention to, what they remember, and what they can learn, that if we just have those in mind when we are developing a website or when we're trying to explain why a particular internet endeavor does or doesn't work, social science can be actually pretty useful here. And so that's where we're headed. But first, let's talk about paths to failure. Okay? So this is about you, and so let's make it about us. And by us now, I mean not just people in the room, but people who are well-intentioned and really want to help improve politics in some way. This is one version of us. In the US, we call them the social sciences. In Great Britain, you might have another name for them. But these are the people who founded the United States of America, right? And people think that they got together and they were in a room and they argued about how to structure the country. And so we could talk about their deliberations, but the basic idea is that people today who use the internet see themselves in the same way, trying to create something new, some new opportunities and things of that nature. All right? And so they're us. They're the people who are trying to do good. And we often contrast ourselves to them. And what they are particularly when things don't work, they're ignorant, and they don't know what we know. And boy, we need to tell them, and shouldn't we have a website that does it? Or they're lazy, that they really should be more involved in politics, and if only we could get them in, they would, or they're just apathetic. And so they need to be cured of things, or at least that's what we think. Right? And so a lot of web-based endeavors are based on this distinction between us and them, with this result. Okay? So the basic premise on the failure of web-based attempts to improve things is the problem isn't them, the problem is us. Okay? The problem is us. And the problem, as I mentioned before, is what it is we believe about people. and how they learn and what they remember and why they do what they do. Our mistake is that we don't pay a lot of attention to what they want. We think we do, but instead what we pay attention to is a fiction that we have in our minds about what a target audience wants. We imagine they want things that we think they should want. But in fact, there's actually what they want. An analogy I use to try and tell the story I'm about to tell is, let's say that you had a friend who was lost in the woods, and that you were an expert on these woods, that you knew a lot about the woods, and you had the ability to get them out. The question is, what would you do? How could you get your friends out of the woods? And what I'd say is the first thing you'd have to know is where in the woods your friend is. Where are they? Because if you don't know where they are, you're in there calling, take 3 steps to the left, and they're walking into a tree. Because you've assumed they're lost in one place when actually they're someplace quite different. The first thing you'd have to know is where they are. The other thing you'd have to know is what can they do? If you're saying, okay, now there's a great big log, climb over it. If your friend is incapable of climbing over the log, despite your expertise on the woods, they're not going to get out, right? So you have to know where they are and what they can do. Otherwise, they're going to be stuck there forever. And that's independent of your fantastic expertise about the woods and how it's laid out. Okay? So when we start to think about what it is you can do, I'm not going to talk a lot about neurobiology. Okay? I can answer questions about it, but here are the guidelines for what follows. Biology is going to define the possibilities. There are certain things that brains can and cannot do that we can't change. All right? Point 1. Point 2, there are social scientific studies of things like learning and persuasion and decisions that are relevant here. I'm not talking about controversial things. I'm talking about basic attributes of these types of behaviors that are well known, that are widely established by thousands of studies, that we ought not to be ignorant of as we move forward. What I'm suggesting here is that we replace idealized notions of what people do with just a couple real ones. And then finally, political contexts. There is a difference between political communication and other types, like the communication you might have when you're teaching math to 3rd graders. Some of the rules some of the things that work well when you're trying to teach children that often come to mind when we think about education are completely abysmal in political contexts. And we'll talk about why that is and how to get around it. But again, this is where we're going. So let's start talking first about how to succeed. And so one would be thinking about how do we persuade people? All right? So by persuasion, I'm using that term in a particular way here. I'm not necessarily talking about changing you from liking liberals to conservatives. I'm talking about changing your mind in any particular way, where that could be I should participate when I didn't think I was, or maybe the change in mind could be I was uncertain about whether I wanted to do something, and now I am certain. So you could want the same things, but you could change your certainty. So by persuasion, I'm talking about any change of mind. I'm using that term broadly. Persuasion is something we need to get people at time 2 to do something that they aren't doing at time 1. And that can be anything, right? So again, this is how I'm using the term. I want to talk about necessary conditions for persuasion. So I'm going to make a distinction here between necessary and sufficient. I'm going to lay out a set of things here that you have to accomplish in order to get people to do new things. If you don't accomplish any of these things, the game is over. You've lost, right? But if you accomplish all of these things, all it can do is improve your odds, right? It's a very competitive world out there, and sometimes even if you do everything you can, you fail. But the point is, at least in the work that I've done, when you actually study the practices of people who are trying to help others through the internet or otherwise, you can trace their failure in their not paying attention to these first 3 conditions. Right, so the point is, you fail at any of these next 3 things, your venture won't succeed. If you want to increase your odds, start here, and then we could go elsewhere. So let's talk about attention. Okay? People often imagine that when they make a speech, or they write a book, or they put on a website, that people, that their audience hears what they say en masse, that they hang on every word, that they understand every paragraph, and that at the end of the day, they come away with the meaning that you intended. Attention doesn't work that way. It can't, because attention is moderated by something called working memory. Okay? working memory, denoted WM here, has a very limited capacity. We can talk about it in terms of 7 plus or minus 2 chunks. That's a technical term, so let me tell you what it means in particular. Right now, you can pay attention to what I'm saying. And if you are, thank you very much. Thanks for coming. But think about the other things that are competing for your attention right now. Several people have just entered the room, and that's sort of interesting, right, when new people enter the room. It's beautiful outside. You could look at that, the paneling in the wall. All of these things are competing with what I'm saying right now for your attention, right? So for what I'm saying to somehow prevail upon you, it has to win that victory. But it's a little harder than that, because not only am I competing with what's here right now, I'm competing with things you could be thinking about, like what you had for lunch. I don't know how many people remember, right? Or you could be thinking about things later. And if you're thinking about those, I'm making things hard for myself right now, it's competing with your ability to pay attention to what I'm saying. But the competition's even worse than that, because what I'm saying right now is competing with what I'm saying right now. Okay? So if you imagine what I was saying a couple seconds ago was really important and you were thinking about it, it makes it hard to pay attention to what I'm saying right now. Okay? So it's hard. We can talk about that. It's hard to do, right? But now when you put together a website or you give a speech, you write a book, why do you imagine that people are listening to your every word? Why do you imagine that they're taking the whole website and exploring it in the way that you who made it would do? And if you're a scholar, maybe you don't make websites, but you're writing papers and giving presentations. Why do you imagine that the rules are different for you? Now, I've met a lot of people who I ask this question to, and they say, but my intentions are great. But I really have good on my side. So yes, I know we don't pay attention generally, but people will pay attention to me, right? Because what I'm doing really matters. What I want to tell you is biology doesn't change the rules for you, right? So we're all subject to these rules. But it's worse than that, right? You thought this was the end. No. The other thing about working memory is an extraordinarily high decay rate, okay? If you've got this little storage facility, working memory, that can only hold 7 plus or minus 2 things, and you're paying attention to what I'm saying now and you're thinking about it, it's crowding out all the other things you could be paying attention to, right? So here's the thing. Even if you pay attention to what I'm saying right now, the likelihood of that word staying in your working memory for any more than a couple of milliseconds is very low. Most of the things to which we pay attention are gone from our attention as quickly as they came in. All right? Again, I'm not saying this to sort of bother you, just to let you know that biology isn't changing the rules for any of us. This is how attention works. So as you think about now how it is that you're going to change people and have them do things, or have them read things, or have them have them think about new things, both of these constraints are limiting you. So think now about all the things that you put on a website, or all the things that you write in a paper, or all the things that you put in a speech. For those things to have a chance of catching the attention of an audience, they have to win this battle for attention. And to win the battle, what has to happen is they have to imply some sort of large change in pleasure or pain. It's the reason that we pay much more attention to somebody when they suggest that something fundamental that we do is wrong than we do to somebody that's saying, oh, you guys are all right, and let me explain all the ways that you're all right. Right? When we see a train coming or we see headlights coming our way, we pay attention and we get out of the way. When we hear a lecture that we've heard 100 times before, our mind can wander. All right? Biology doesn't change the rules for any of us. So if you want to win this battle, right, urgency matters. Now you might say, okay, but again, what I'm up to is really important. Fine. So what I want you to think about now are the most important things that have ever happened in your life. Okay? It could be like a marriage, or it could be the day that you graduated. It could be the birth of a child. And now what I want to ask you is, how many of these things do you really remember? If you're married or if you've graduated, think now about all the things you remember about your wedding day. I'll bet you that a minute from now, you're exhausted. That you've probably remembered everything you can remember about the most important day of your life. Okay? And if you can't remember much about that, what chance does your website or your speech or your conference paper have? All right? The point is, the things that you want people to remember are not necessarily what they remember. So having that in mind as you now construct what you're trying to do is critical to your success. All right? Urgency and relevance are a key. All right? But let's continue, and we'll talk about how to try and win these battles. Elaboration. Elaboration is the word that scientists use, that psychologists use to represent thinking about it. I have paid attention to you, and now I am thinking about what it is you have said to me. What thinking represents here is I'm trying to connect what I'm seeing or hearing to things that I already know. That's what learning is, right? Physically, what it's like, you can think about, like when you work out, your muscles get strong, and if you run, your reaction time, so you can, duck from balls, and you can sort of, swing bats and things like that. When you work out, your brain works the same way. There are axons and there are little dendrites. There are fingers at the end of them. And as you think about something, you're bringing electrical activity through them, which strengthens them and makes them grow. The reason that this affects learning is that when it grows and it shrinks the gap between that and another dendrite, what that means is you're more likely to remember the connection between those two things. So what learning is physically is trying to narrow gaps between dendrites, so that activation potentials increase, so that the next time you see or hear something that's like the lesson you're being told, you're likely to remember and use it. So that's physically what learning is, all right? So now when we think about how would the type of things you present, how do they affect what others do or what they remember, what attention, if you can win it, provides you with is an opportunity to leave a cognitive legacy. The opportunity to give someone a new memory that they can use later on as they think about politics or policy or whatever. Okay? It gives you the opportunity. And what you're trying to get, again, from a physical level, is a change in activation potentials. So let's say I'm trying to get you to think that participating in online deliberation is a good idea. So the goal then would be the next time you're presented with an opportunity to participate in online deliberation, the reasons for doing it, the good ideas, the sort of good feelings you might get come to mind, which would then make you do it. All right, so attention gives you an opportunity to do that, but it's just an opportunity. Long-term memory requires that elaboration. It requires the person to do the physical work of thinking about, what is this thing you're telling me? How does it connect to what I know? And is it a good thing or a bad thing if I change my behavior in the future? If I'm paying attention to you, but I'm not doing the work of trying to connect this to what I know, whatever you're saying to me is gone in the future. The next time I encounter it, it's as if it never happened. I actually have to try and do the work of connecting the lesson to the activity. Okay? So how do we get people to pay attention to things? So I love a room like, do you have the ability to follow me? I'm going to walk a little bit. Okay. So one of the things I like about sort of attention and thinking is that we have a good way of sort of presenting ourselves to people as if we're really paying attention to what they say, right? We nod at the right time, we make eye contact, and that's a social gesture. But really, oftentimes we're thinking about something else when we do that. And so one of the reasons I like a room like this is we have wireless in here, right? And you have laptops. So what I'd invite you to do is someone in front of you has a laptop right now, right? And so they might be taking notes on this lecture, and if you are, thank you very much. But also they might not be, okay? They might be looking at the internet, checking I don't know if there's any sports going on right now, or the stock market, or whatever. Now, what's interesting is that when that happens in a room like this, oh, that's very rude, the lecturer is talking, and you're there looking at the stock market. From my point of view, that's not news at all. What those screens tell you is what happens every time you talk to somebody, right? I could be talking to you, and we're pretending, but you could be thinking about something else right now, even though you're nodding. Thank you very much. Right? Those screens tell you what, if you study communication, we already know, right? So I don't consider it rude, but the point is, even when you think people are thinking about things, they may not be. Because for people to think about things, it really has to be relevant to them. It really, if I'm trying to get you to change your mind about politics or participation or so forth, you're going to need a very good reason. Why? Because you have pretty good reasons for doing what you're doing already. Right? You have a lifetime of experiences that have led you to decide to become involved in politics or not, to use the internet or not, or so forth. I think of it a lot like boxing, right? If you want to be the champion in boxing, you have to beat the heavyweight champ. right? And the heavyweight champ didn't get randomly assigned, right? They beat the other guys. And so if you're trying to get to have somebody do something new, your idea has to beat the heavyweight champ, right? So these new things have to be unique and highly relevant if you want people to think about them. No matter how important your idea is, if your audience doesn't see it as essential to their own goals, right, they won't do it. And these are some of the reasons that so many cars are driven off cliffs in the internet world. Because we just assume that what's important to us has to be important to them, and if we simply show it to other people, they'll see that. That's not how it works, right? We have to think about what's relevant to them. One of the things that I get to do now is I talk to climate scientists a lot. I'm brought in front of audiences all over the place. And climate scientists, they have an issue right now. The issue is why are so many people ignoring us? Look, we have a consensus. There's thousands of studies that say, that the climate change is happening and there are bad effects, and the news media won't report it, and people in government won't do anything about it. Right? So why is that? And I understand it's a little different in Europe, but still. And so here's the problem when you talk about climate change, okay? Because you can be a great expert on climate. However, biology doesn't change the rules for you either. So for most citizens, the benefits of doing something like reducing emissions are distant, abstract, and uncertain. If we all ride our bikes to work or drive a hybrid, exactly what's going to happen? Well, we don't know. We don't know. But I'm asking you to do these things. I'm asking you to change your lifestyle. And if you do that, the costs to you are immediate, right? They're concrete and they're certain. It's like asking somebody to trade the cow for magic beans, right? It's not a deal that people want to take a lot. So if your goal is to try and get people to support climate emissions, it doesn't mean you can't talk about science. It does mean that you have to talk about the facts in ways that are relevant to people. Talk about pollution. Talk about children. Talk about your petrol bills, and your electric bills. You might say, oh, but you're not telling all the science that way. If our goal is to try and get people to change their behaviors, we have to talk about it in ways that are relevant to them. Again, biology doesn't change the rules for us. So you've seen images like this, right? The climate's melting, and there's this polar bear on an ice cap. For some of you, you might say, OK, now I get it. But for most people, it's like, I think polar bears live there, and I think they know how to deal with this, right? This isn't a big issue, right? Or it could be, that's great, but I'm not a polar bear, and polar bears live very far away. So why do I need to worry about this? Okay? Here's another presentation, right? Look, Europe's green. Isn't this great? This is scientific data on climate change presented for an audience. It has to do with estimated deaths attributed to climate change per year. Okay? So a couple things about this. Like, what is this trying to get you to do? Because you might say, oh, we're green. OK, I don't have to worry about this anymore. Right? Or it could be, well, all the red's down in Africa and South America. Yeah, it's hot down there anyways, so. Right? This is not an effective way to present the information. No offense to the people who made this slide. But what are you going to accomplish here? Right? And we're talking about deaths, right? And so it's deaths per million. Right? Now, anybody dying is a tragic thing, but if you sort of, if you're from North America or Europe, say, oh, 2 people out of a million, well, more people of that die from, choking on candy or something. Right? I'm just saying this would not be a thing to present. Like, who would this persuade? Okay? So very well-intentioned people produce a slide like this, produce images like this to try and get you to rethink climate change. But at the end of the day, if we're paying insufficient attention to what our audience wants and we're trying to get them to change what they do, our good intentions aren't enough. Right? Our folk theories of what they should want to pay attention to, of what they should take seriously, won't save us at that moment. Okay? If you want to try and win battles for attention, if you want to try and get people to think about what you're doing, the rules don't change for you. It's always about, I think, making it local. And I don't mean local geographically. I mean local personally. I mean, it is knowing why is your target audience doing what they want to do, doing what they're doing right now. Why are they doing it? And if you don't know the answer to that question, right, the chance of your website succeeding is probably nil. Right? If you don't know, or if you're writing about the internet and you don't know why the conventional wisdom is like it is, your ability to topple it is probably going to be minimized. Right? You have to understand why your audience is doing what they do now. And then, right, the thing you have to do is present them with some concrete and bad implication of continuing current practices. Here's something that you do now that can lead to something that is bad for you now. Bad for you in 100 years, right? That's not the type of thing that people can really grasp. Bad for you now, people get that, right? And then, can you present what you're doing in a way that says, look, there's a different way to do this. It's possible for you to do it, and I'm now going to show you how to do it, right? These are the ways that you can get people to start rethinking what they're doing, right? But a lot of people don't do this, so they end up driving off cliffs. I want to show you an example. I'm tempted to show you research I've done on this, but I have a better idea. This is a study that a graduate student of mine has just done, and I think it's lovely, all right? Microtargeting. So what this term means, right, is that you have something you want to do, but you realize that people are different, and so you try and sort of target messages to smaller audiences, and you can do that on the internet, right? That's great. And so one of the places that this is done in politics is with respect to trying to raise money for political campaigns, right? In the US, this is a big business. Okay? So why do people donate? And so studies have been done on this. And a lot of people donate because they're asked individually. So again, I don't know about the campaign finance laws in European countries, but in the US, lots of people give donations. But it's typically in response to a request. They don't just decide to do it. Oh, should I buy groceries today or give to some political campaign that hasn't contacted me? Right? They're contacted. And the conventional wisdom on how to get campaign solicitations is to mention important issues. Okay? Think about the important issue and say, look, you care about this issue, vote for me. Right? But there is a potential problem with this strategy that comes from not thinking about what the audience wants. And that is, some issues can remind you that you don't have any money. And you might say, all right, who would be stupid enough to try and make a campaign appeal that reminds people that they don't have any money? So without offense, I'm going to give you a few examples. All right, so this is an actual campaign mailer sent out by Hillary Clinton. And part of it says, I'm in this race for everyone who needs a champion. Okay, what does that mean? For the hardworking families who are losing sleep over gas prices and grocery costs and mortgage payments and medical bills. And then down here, she asks, make a contribution today to help me win. Okay, you say, all right, but she lost, and so, So here's another example. This fellow did pretty well at raising money in the US, and yet here's a mailer that he sent out. He said, well, we know the truth. It didn't work. Instead of prosperity trickling down, pain has trickled up. We're losing jobs. Deficits are exploding. Our economy is in turmoil. Please rush a generous donation of $100, $150, or $200 to Obama today. The conventional wisdom is telling these folks that you have to do this. You have to talk about the economy because it's important. But now what I want to ask you is, suppose we could run an experiment on something like this and figure out, should you really mention these issues if you want to raise money? In other words, should you really take account of how the people receiving this message hear it? All right? So my student has done this, and so here's a hypothesis. If you talk about an issue that reminds people of their financial struggles, you're going to have a harder time raising money. Okay? It doesn't seem that hard, but again, this is not in the conventional wisdom, and it's not in the existing literature on this topic. Hypothesis 2 is, if we have an issue that is important but doesn't remind them of the financial struggles, they'll donate more. And another hypothesis that isn't up here is that if we're asking people to do things that don't involve money, then maybe we can remind them they're poor. Okay? So let's see how this might work. So here's a first experiment. 328 people who are undergraduate students. They're recruited using posters. They're paid $10 for showing up. And this simple experiment is going to test the first two hypotheses. I will say the student has also run this experiment on a national population using knowledge networks, but this design is a little simpler, so I'm going to show this. Okay? So there's a control group. They're given information about an issue. They're asked about a donation, and then they're given a questionnaire so we can find out how they were thinking about things. In the financial issue group, they are given the general information about contributing, and then they're told about an issue that reminds them of financial struggles. Now, in the case with the students, they were told the issue was about reforming policy with respect to textbooks. And this was reminding them, they were reminded here about how poor college students are. Then there's a non-financial issue group, and here they were told about an issue that didn't remind them, and this was about the length of textbooks. Well, some of them are too long, all right? So we have an issue about the cost, we have an issue about the length, okay? So the predictions here are that compared to the control group, if you remind people of how poor they are, they're going to donate less. People have a chance to donate their money. But if you give the same issue, if you have the same group, the same type of donation possibility, but you don't mention how poor they are, they'll contribute more. And this is what happens, okay? So this is the average contribution. This is the control group, okay? You can see that when you remind people that they're poor, a lot fewer of them donate. But if you have the same issue and don't remind them of that, there's no difference. And you can see that this is the average contribution. This is the percentage of people who contributed. So it's the same data. Again, reminding people that they're poor, right, actually decreases donations compared to having the same issue and not doing that. Again, this is seeing it from the other people's point of view. But just to help you put this in context, let me talk about the second experiment really quick, where we're testing an alternative explanation. So here, instead of asking them to donate money, they're being asked to donate time. So they're going to be reminded that they don't have any money, but they're not being asked to contribute money. They're asked to contribute time. Everything else about these experiments is identical. What's shown to them, what's presented to them, everything else. Okay? So here's the control group and the financial interest group, but now they're being asked to volunteer. Okay? And here's your conclusion, or here's what you find. Here's your control group. 20% say they'll volunteer when they're not given a reason. Here, people are given the reason, even though they're told that people don't have money, and a lot more of them will volunteer. All right? So when we ask them for money and remind them they're poor, they don't contribute it, we ask them for time, it doesn't have any effect. In fact, the conventional wisdom survives. Okay? Again, you saw the Clinton and the Obama campaigns, very well-run organizations, but in this case, working on insufficient attention to the letter recipients, on what they want. And so they're making the same kind of mistake that so many people have made as they put websites together. So there's one more point I want to introduce, and we'll get to Q&A, I think about 10 minutes. Is that all right? Yeah. All right, fair enough. Is credibility. All right? And so let's say now that you've won the battle for attention and you've got people to think about things. What I've mentioned is that politics is a little bit different, and the reason has to do with credibility. Okay? So to try and put this in context, I have a question for you. And the question is, what is that? What is that? Okay? So you can take a second to think about it. Okay? What this is a rabbit duck. Okay? It's a rabbit duck. If you want to see the rabbit, there's the nose, and there are the ears. Okay, if you want to see the duck, there's the beak, and there's the back of his head. And there's his eye. Well, he's looking that way. What's unusual about this image is that it has multiple meanings, right? And the reason that it's a bit sort of troubling and interesting, this image was actually produced for the first PhD in psychology produced at Harvard, just for what it's worth, about 100 years ago. But the idea of this rabbit duck is it has multiple meanings. Now, the reason that's relevant for us is that usually a picture has one meaning, or we look at it and we think, I know what that is. It's why I don't know if we have the saying. I don't know if you have the saying in Europe, but a picture's worth 1,000 words, right? The reason for that exchange rate is that words have multiple meanings all the time, but pictures are supposed to have more solid meanings. Okay? Why is this relevant for politics? Well, it's because I think in the political context, the multiple meanings of words cause problems for communication and persuasion. Okay? So let's think about politics. Why do we have them? It's because we have some basic types of conflicts, basic issue conflicts, basic value conflicts that aren't easily resolved. They work themselves into the political realm. But when we mix that with language indeterminacy, the notion that words have multiple meanings, when we mix conflict and language indeterminacy, what we get is incentives to manipulate meaning. Right? So what happens in politics is not just what you say, but how you say it becomes a big part of the game. And you know that when a politician speaks incorrectly about an issue, they're pounced on by the other side. Right? This is part of what happens when you're trying to deal with value conflicts. All right? As a result, now if we're trying to explain why do people believe some things and not others, credibility is essential. Right? It's not just what you say, it's the legitimacy behind it. right? And you might say, well, is politics really that different than other settings? And so let me give you an example. Math class. Remember when you were in grade school, maybe 3rd grade, 4th grade, 2nd grade, and you were being taught mathematics, okay? What was the room like, right? Typically, there was a desk or a table. Maybe there was a number line at the front of the classroom, maybe some simple reminders of what 2 + 2 equals and 3 + 3 and things of that nature. You'd have a teacher who was an authority figure at the beginning of the room. Maybe they had a table or a lectern, and they'd go up there and they'd tell you things, right? And the idea of how people learn is the students would pay attention to the teacher and write it down, right? Try and remember it. Maybe they'd have some tests, right? Maybe they'd get the test back and see how they did. Maybe the test would have to be shown to their parents. Right? And so that's how we think about learning. And what I want to suggest to you is learning in politics is a little bit different than that. If it were just this, we could take any education manual and use it to talk about how people learn. But instead, I want you to think about what would we have to do to this classroom to change it into politics? Okay? What we'd have to do. First of all, the tests, they're gone. Right? The number line at the front of the room, the little equations, well, if you don't pay attention to politics, they're replaced by nothing. And if you're on the internet or television, they're replaced by noise in every direction. More things than you could possibly pay attention to. All right? So these change everything. There are no parents to oversee. But here's the biggest thing that changes in terms of politics. Imagine yourself in that classroom, and the teacher walks up to the lectern, and they say, class, 2 + 2 = 4. And right after that, a second teacher walks up and they say, class, if you believe that, it'll ruin your life. Right? What would it do to a student? What would it do? I'm not talking about afterwards. What if you knew that that was always possible? That any claim that one person made would be countered by another person saying, you know what, that might not be right. How would you hear the first statement? 2 + 2 = 4, huh? What's your angle? Right? It fundamentally changes what people believe and what they think about. Right? This is why political communication is quite different than other types of communication, and why you have to think about your own credibility if you want to ever have an impact in political realms. Okay? So for contested issues, high credibility is a must. It matters not just what you say, but why people should find it legitimate. Okay? A thing that a lot of experts don't understand about credibility is it doesn't have to do so much with your attributes. So some people say, well, look, I'm a climate scientist. Of course I'm credible. That isn't how it works. Credibility is domain-specific and bestowed by an audience. So probably most of you in here have given presentations at one time or another, right? And in some rooms you walk in and people are primed to believe you, maybe because you're part of a social network where your credibility is well established. But we can take the same you and the same speech and give it in a completely different environment, and it won't go anywhere. People doubt you. You're a social scientist? Get out of here, right? You study the internet? Are you on the fringe? Like, I don't, right? I mean, you've been in those cases. The credibility isn't about you. I mean, you're certainly part of it, but credibility is always bestowed by others, okay? And this is, again, a place where people drive off the cliff. They go, I'm credible, so if I say it, people will believe me, right? What you need to think about is, are you credible? And if you are, then fine. But if you're not, how can you establish credibility? Right? This is a step that a lot of people skip. There is a large literature on credibility in the psychology literature. I won't go over it, but there's the main 4 categories are source effects, that is, attributes of the speaker, okay? But that they don't work in isolation. There are message effects, what you say. There are contextual effects, where it is said. So you could take me, and I'm saying the same words. If you put me here, maybe I'm persuasive. You put me in a room full of physicists, maybe they don't care, right? And then there's audience effects. Maybe you hold the person constant, what they're saying constant, in the room constant, but you change the audience. All of these factors affect who and how someone's persuasive. Okay? I'm happy to take questions about those. I'm not going to go into great detail. The point is, credibility is something, it's not automatic. Okay? I will give you a couple rules for it, though. This comes from my prior work. Again, I'm not going to go in that in great detail, but I can answer questions. If you want to think about a simple rubric, a simple rule for who is credible, it has to do with perceived interest proximity and perceived knowledge. So if on the issue we're talking about, if you think that I want the same things that you want, right, That's necessary for credibility. If you think, I want something very different than you want, like I want to ruin you, you might be less willing to take my advice. It also matters that you perceive me as being knowledgeable, right? That I know what I'm talking about. If you perceive me as having your interests at heart, but me being a complete idiot, right, then you can nod at the right times and seem like you're paying attention, but actually thinking about what I'm saying and trying to act on it in the future is not going to happen. Okay? These effects are interactive, and the key is the perception. I'm sorry to say that, but the key for persuasion is not whether I actually share your interests or whether I actually know anything. The key for persuasion actually occurring is that your audience perceives these two things. Right? I've run a range of experiments on this. Right? But the basic idea is it's the audience's perceptions that matter. This is a key point, again, where replacing the ideal with reality can help you succeed. The ideal might be, no, people really should know who is knowledgeable, and people really should know who shares their interests. I agree with that. But if we're trying to explain why some people are persuasive in some circumstances and not in others, the reality is replaced by the perception. That's what drives it. Right? So again, if we want to think about how to succeed, how do we give people perceptions of knowledge and interest? I'm going to close with an idea about how to do that, but this is the basic idea. Okay? So how would you build trust? How would you stand in front of an audience or sort of present your website or your work to a group who initially don't know you from anybody? How do you do that? Okay? There are a number of ways, but one way I want to talk to you about comes from Habermas, of all places. Okay? So Habermas is a philosopher. Some people would argue one of the most important 20th century philosophers. Some people would argue the most important. The basic situation that Habermas studies is as follows. He's interested in social organization, interested in how it is that collective decisions come to be seen as legitimate. Here's the problem. In the era of modernity, where people can travel and visit with people of other cultures, can go around the world, can visit, we don't have the old crutch we used to use in terms of social legitimacy. So in most societies, there are stories about right and wrong. There are stories about what's true and what's false. Often they're in the form of divination stories, right? The reason that we know that something is right is a divination story. The problem is when you travel around the world, you find out there are different divination stories, and they're not all the same. So that's what Habermas talks about as modernity. And the notion is when you have this sort of cultural clash, it's very hard to go back to a particular story and say, well, this is going to be our basis of assessing right and wrong. So then the challenge for him is, well, how do we create legitimacy for collective decisions in that situation? Okay, that's the problem. And what he proposes is an ideal discourse. And in this ideal discourse, everyone has an equal right to participate. Right? Everyone has an equal right to be heard. Okay? And then, if people unanimously assent to norms that are produced by this process, they can be the basis of legitimate social action. So Habermas's idea is, if we're going to have trouble agreeing on what truth is, then instead of truth, maybe we can just have norms and base society on things that we agree to. Okay? That's the basic idea. And so saying if that happens, you can facilitate collective legitimacy. And so this sounds I read through all the abstracts in some of the papers. This idea sounds like what we're going to hear in some of the papers, right? If we give people the opportunity to talk to one another, then lots of great things can happen. Okay? So Habermas is both influential and controversial. Okay? And the controversy comes from, can you actually implement anything like this, and would it work? Okay? And so I'm not going to go through the whole controversy, but let me suggest that the answer to that question has a lot to do with the answers to questions we've been talking about for the last 30 minutes now. That is, what do we have to know about the target audiences to make this true? Okay? So again, if we're trying to generate credibility, the quality of being believed, it helps to be seen as legitimate, of acting in accordance with a particular set of rules so that what you're about. So the tagline here is, how do you build trust? To try and build legitimacy by being transparent about how you're doing what you're doing. right? That's what makes that's what makes science as a general matter credible, right? The idea that we're willing to be procedurally transparent. It's why we value replication so much. It's why we value, when a scientist makes a grand claim and they can't replicate it, it's why we all get suspicious. So it's one way to try and build credibility when you don't have it. But would the Habermas idea work? Okay. A lot of people are studying this, but I have a paper that I could talk to you about. Is Habermas's idea can't work unless you expand the domain of transparency. In other words, it's unfair to say that I'd make a critique of Habermas because, as I'll show you in a second, Habermas anticipates the problems I'm talking about. But if you want to criticize the ideal that an ideal discourse can create collective legitimacy, it's because when people talk to one another, they don't always listen to one another. We've heard that, right? I mean, we talked about attention, and that causes problems. That causes problems. Let me give you some examples, okay? I have a paper now where we've done a meta-analysis of over 100 studies in psychology and other fields about what happens when you actually let people talk to one another, right? This is in person, but it can be done online as well. What happens? One of Habermas's motivations was that, well, the way that you get legitimacy is to give everyone a chance, right? If you have power asymmetries in the background, that undercuts legitimacy. So giving everyone a chance to speak should change that. But what do we know about that? So I want you to think about interruptions, order effects, right? By order effects, I mean who speaks first, and disagreement. Okay? So let me tell you about interruptions. In studies of open communication on juries, what do you think, in terms of interruption, it turns out that men interrupt women far more than women interrupt men. Okay? Whites interrupt non-whites far more than non-whites interrupt whites. High socioeconomic status people interrupt non-high socioeconomic status far more than the opposite happens. So in any given conversation, if you just look at who's jumping in when someone else is talking and having their point of view, this is just what happens. Okay? All right, so that's interesting, right? Except if you then pair it up with order effects. What do I mean by order effects? Well, it turns out if you document conversations people are having, and you say, let's say I say, the sky is blue, and then you say the dog is red. So I go first, you go second. All else constant, going first has a huge advantage in influencing the rest of the conversation. That is, someone else later in the conversation is far more likely to pick up on what was said first than what was said second. And they're far more likely to pick up on what was said second than what's said third. Combine those two things. Order effects matter, and rich white guys interrupt everybody else. Right? What do you think happens at the end of a procedurally equal conversation? Right? The rich white guy's ideas dominate the conversation. Right? This is not a normative statement about what should be or what shouldn't be. This is an empirical statement about, at least in the US, what is. And so if you were trying now to build an ideal discourse or a web environment where everyone participated, I think you'd want to know that before you built it. Think about what rules you could use if what you want is everyone really to participate. Think what kind of communicative rules or what kind of environment you'd want to set up. You'd want to know that beforehand, as opposed to pretending that an ideal world exists where everybody listens to everybody else and nobody interrupts, and you can't find any socioeconomic or gender or race patterns in how this happens. Right? I think it's better to deal with the real than the ideal. Okay? Okay? And Habermas, again, this is not a critique of Habermas because he anticipates this. Right? He's putting this out as an ideal. Right? The issue is, as we start to think about implementing these ideas, the target audience really matters. Where people are in the woods really matters. What logs they can jump over really matters. And so if we want to try and change policy or make collective decisions more legitimate or increase participation, we really have to start with the real and not the ideal. Okay? These are ways that you can build legitimacy, right? The thing I do take from Habermas that I think is worth remembering is building legitimacy requires procedural transparency. I've seen this in activities that I've been involved with in the last couple of years, right? The national election studies. It's a large academic election study. And if you had asked people in 1999 to tell you about the national election studies, a lot of people would have equated it to a dinosaur. Right? A lot of people didn't feel like it was almost ended, right? There were conversations at the National Science Foundation in the US about ending the national election studies, and its funding had been severely reduced after 40 years of being the most cited and used academic election study in the US. A bunch of people saw part of the problem as one of legitimacy. People didn't trust the national election studies. And the reason is they had no idea how the questions were put on there. They felt like they had no input as to how it was done, right? And so a lot of the support went away. One of the key things that we did, right, in changing it, and now I'll just tell you, now the National Election Studies has a huge budget, right? A lot of support. I'll give you an example. But what we decided to do was open it up. If you go online to the ANES, we opened up an online commons. And basically the idea there is all questions on these studies now would have to be put on an internet site for everyone to see and defended, right? So nothing was going to be done in secret. All the ideas could be put in front of the public, all right? And so part of these walls that people felt became between them and the design of the study that they all wanted to use were broken down, okay? What happened is for our 2008 studies, we had over 700 scholars propose over 3,000 questions for the NES. And of all the NES has some questions you have to run from the past, and it had new questions. All of the new questions came from this online commons. Now, people feel like it's more procedurally transparent. There's a lot more support for it. This was a way to build trust, right? It's a way that we did that. I can tell you other things about the study if you want, but I won't tell you now. There's some very cool things we did. The other thing I'll mention just while we're here is Helen talked about tests. Right? Another thing that people trust that was sort of created out of nothing is tests. Tests, I don't know if you know about it, but basically, if you have an idea about an experiment that you want to run, and you want to use the internet to run it, but you don't want to rely on college students or convenience sample, tests can get you access to a representative or a roughly representative sample of people in the US. And it'll do it for free. The idea is you send in a proposal, there's a peer review process. If the reviewers give it the thumbs up, they will run it for you. You don't have to know how to do this. All you have to have is a good idea for an experiment. Again, the idea here was open this opportunity up, tell people how you're going to do it, and then do it, right? And in the 7 years of tests, it's now run over 200 experiments for people from all different fields. And this is available to any of you. But the idea here is, you guys know about open source, right? I mean, test was sort of, test wasn't possible without internet technology. But when we built it, the idea was to try and be as open as possible about everything to give this thing some legitimacy. All right? So, some conclusions. The reason that in the aggregate we succeed, but in individual cases we fail, is that as experts, whether we're writing about the internet or whether we're trying to make differences with the internet, we often overestimate our persuasive power. We think that the limits on attention and elaboration don't apply to us. We think that we're credible just because of who we are, rather than because we know what our audience wants and believes, right? Just because change can occur doesn't mean that it will. A key thing in success in any of these domains is remembering that the audience had reasons for what they're doing. And it's important to understand those reasons if you're going to try to get them to change. Right? Just because you think they should change what they're doing doesn't mean that they will. And ultimately, if what you're trying to do is give people a new competence, whether that's competence at being a participant, competence at changing policy, competence at knowing things, one of the big mistakes that we make in the internet domain is thinking that information transmission is the same as competence transmission. It isn't. It's real easy to supply information. I'm doing it right now. We do it all the time. Getting people to rethink what they've been doing in a material way, that's harder, but it's possible to do, right? If you think about just basic aspects of what people do when they learn, you might be able to drive this thing to cool places, all right? And so thinking about attention and memory and so forth, I think, are necessary conditions for getting there. Thank you. So how are we going to do this?
Thank you very much. Yeah, we've got a mic so that people can ask questions. Take around the mic. Just while we're getting the mic, I might ask you one question because I've got one. Just while you were talking, I was thinking about I mean, in some ways, does this mean it looks a bit gloomy for online political persuasion? I mean, because many of these things that you were talking about are actually very different, difficult in online environments. The competition for attention is much greater. There's usually fairly sort of low levels of pleasure and pain. Benefits and costs can both be low. And I was trying to think of the things that kind of survive. I mean, credibility is also a major problem in online environments. And I suppose one of the things that survive, well, I mean, is order effects. I mean, it does become perhaps easier for people to know who did something first, for the kind of first mover to have an influence on other people. But I mean, I don't know if that quite categorises as an order effect. Another thing is transparency, obviously. I mean, the internet has almost de facto created transparency, although there is some evidence that transparency can actually have a negative effect as well on trust. I mean, you know, that the more transparent, there's an interesting experiment actually in the policy, the last issue of the Policy and Internet Journal, where somebody did an experiment to test the effect of making local councils more transparent on climate change, and it actually reduced people's trust. The more they knew about what the local council was doing on the issue of climate change, the less they seemed to trust it. So I mean, we can't go reverse. But I suppose one of the ones that really survives is the kind of make it local one, because the internet provides so many possibilities to kind of create small worlds and to make something local. Create the hotel room online or whatever. Which is a bit ironic, isn't it? It was supposed to be this great globalising force, and if that was where the real influence came in this kind of local environment. So
yeah. No, it's an interesting set of comments. I mean, I think let me talk about globalizing first, because one of the maybe you can. When we thought about the internet as globalized, I think part of it was because we were using television and radio as a model, right? The idea that, you know, we had a way to talk to people, and now we can expand that. But it reminds me, the very first television advertisements, so it's interesting to go back to the dawn of television and to think about what they thought television was going to do. The very first televised political advertisements in the US, somebody took a billboard and they filmed it. Right? The notion being, at the time, if you wanted to communicate with a lot of people, a billboard was a way. And so people thought, well, how should we communicate our message? Well, billboards really work, and so now we'll put billboards on television, and that will be wonderful. And so I think some of the early ideas for the internet, well, let's just put TV on the internet, and then that'll be great. Right? And so I think that was, but I think the real promise of the internet comes from realizing the great differences in people. And the reason that TV worked as it did is because you couldn't micro-target TV. It was technologically impossible. So you were forced to come up with things that sort of mass audiences would put up with in the absence of competition, right? But as we go from sort of 3 channels to 4 billion, now you can do so many more things. But so I think that, I don't know, I think with respect to globalization, I think if you have a universally sort of relevant message, there are global impacts, but I think the real power of the internet is the localization. And if all people were the same and none of the things I talked about mattered, then globalization would be, I think, more interesting. But the fact that different things are relevant to people, the fact that different things are urgent to people, I think it means that there is not going to be no one-size-fits-all on the internet. I'll stop there because I want to take questions from, yeah.
Hello, my name is... Yes, my name is Ray Rosales from Canada.
Hey, Ray.
Can you talk a little bit about the phenomenon called Sarah Palin and the Tea Partiers within the context of what you explained here in terms of messaging and
sure.
So, why are they succeeding?
Well, that's let me sort of talk about it in the way that we just did, right? So the Tea Party started out as a very sort of started out relatively small. And it's still relatively small in terms of the US population. Would some version of the Tea Party been able to get on television in a 3-network environment? right? Probably not, right? Because if there's 3 networks, your economies of scale are built around getting a market share of at least a quarter or a third, right? So putting on programming that maybe 5% of the people cared about meant you were going to lose market share to the other 2. Or if we think about a 2-newspaper sort of city, right? Again, if part of what they care about is market share, and again, I need like 30% of the market to survive, I'm not going to have a lot of stuff for 5%. Well, now we go to the internet, right? The economies of scale are completely different. I mean, you and I can go out this afternoon and make a website that in principle everyone could see, right? And so now the ability to put things on that 5% would like. So I'll just, in the US, people know about Fox News, right? Fox News is associated. I don't know the exact number, but the daily viewership of Fox News is something like 3 million. So that's 1%.
Average viewing figures at any one time is just 2 million.
2 million. Okay, but so the U.S. population is 305 million, right? Just to sort of put this in perspective, right? So on any given day, fewer than 1 in 100 Americans are watching Fox News.
So it's cumulative. At any one time, 2 million are watching.
So, but in a day, it's like 3. It gets up to 6 or 8, right? Right. So, but on an average day, it's 1 to 2 out of every 100 Americans. So I think before the internet, with very few channels, they couldn't have gotten on the air. I think now they can. There's a place for that. Does that answer? Have I answered your question? Okay. Thank you.
Nick Hansted from the London School of Economics. You sort of triggered a thought in my head that's been going around for a little while anyway. But I wondered if there's maybe a sense of we need to rethink what we mean by transparency. I've just left the UEA, actually, and obviously the UEA had a little difficulty that some of you may have heard about information to do with University of East Anglia, to do with the climate change.
Yes,
emails. But what struck me about that, it wasn't the mass of data, and very often we release these big data sets and equate that to transparency, but it's the anecdote, it's the one line in an email that actually takes on the significance. So if local government maybe, or government nationally, takes transparency to releasing big data sets, are they actually making themselves a hostage to fortune because they'll find, malevolent voices might find that one anecdote that they can then use and run with and persuade people of a particular position?
Yeah. So I think at the very micro level, transparency isn't always a good thing. But as you aggregate, I mean, think about East Anglia for a moment. Suppose the data isn't available, right? Suppose all the other emails that put the few emails into context aren't available. That story blows up even more, right? I mean, I think I think, but the bigger issue with East Anglia, I think, is because of the nature of the media competition, because of to get attention, shocking things are now sort of more newsworthy. We just take that for granted that shocking things are going to be in the news. And with respect to climate, what's interesting is scientifically there is a huge consensus around so many of these important issues, and yet there are going to be news entities that want to put out the salacious stuff. And there are other news entities that, working on a journalistic norm of balance, think that they have to give both sides equal weight, which is interesting because in science, I mean, sort of all of these views plausibly have equal weight. It's just that one view has been inundated, has been crushed by logic and evidence, right? And so I don't know if I've answered your question, but I think in the aggregate, the East Anglia thing is sort of contained, right? Because now people who want to pay attention to it understand the context. They've seen the 1,000 emails, they've seen all the data, and people who want to fictionalize what that meant also have the power to do that, but they had the power to do that before the internet, right? I think that now, at least with the internet, you can fight back with data. But I take your point. I mean, transparency can lead to some outcomes that are, that are not great. But as a general matter, if you want to build legitimacy for something that you're doing, right, procedural transparency, I think, is a way to do it.
Barbara Simons, I'm from the US and Canada. I want to thank you for a very interesting talk. And there are a couple of points you touched on that I wanted to pick up on. The first was when you talked about cars going over the cliff and having to understand the car. That to me sounds like having to understand the underlying technology of the internet. And The second point, which feeds into the first, is your offhanded reference to physicists not listening to your talk. I'm a computer scientist. I don't know how many of us there are here. I suspect not many. And I've felt for a long time that there is a communication gap between the people who understand the technology of the internet in the sense of a computer scientist and the people who are writing commentary on it, namely the social scientists. And I would hope that we could, maybe in the future, do more outreach to each group. I mean, I'm sorry that there wasn't more of a technical track here, actually. If you would like to comment on that.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry, if I make one more quick comment. I think as a result, sometimes social scientists will advocate particular positions because they sound good to all of us, unless you happen to understand that the underlying technology is not hospitable to that position.
I think so. I'd agree with the first premise, but I'd want to modify it. I mean, it's not so much the technology, it's the interaction of the technology and the person. Right, so the technology on its own does nothing, but when you interact the technology with things we know about the people, right, is that right? The main point I was trying to make is we tend to work with fictionalized models of the people that are easily falsifiable, and that if we took things about if we took knowable things about how people learn and what they remember and we would design things maybe a bit differently. So, and I'm sorry, the second question. Oh, with respect to interdisciplinarity. It's different. It's difficult, you know. I mean, disciplines develop ways of knowing. They end up being called paradigms. They can be like different cultures. It's not just sort of what people know, but the stories they tell about how they know what they know can become very different, such that it can be very difficult for two people who think they're talking about the same thing to actually communicate. I don't know that there's an easy way to solve those things, but to the extent that I have relationships with people in other disciplines, I don't try and attack that problem from the we should do more interdisciplinary work level. I try to attack it from the here is a concrete problem. Your way of doing it leads to failure. I will demonstrate an alternate way of doing it. Let's talk, right? And that typically gets people's attention. Yeah. Yes. Oh, exactly. Yeah.
Thank you. James Gomez, Monash University, Australia. I would like to sort of get your thoughts on credibility, destruction of credibility, and rebuilding credibility using new media. The context is in authoritarian regimes where they have media control, they use the traditional mainstream media that they have control over to destroy the credibility of political opponents, whether they are from political parties or civil societies. And so, you know, credibility is destroyed, and part of the challenge is rebuilding credibility and, you know, in particular how new media can help in that role.
Well, I mean, the interesting thing, right, is that when state-owned media has a monopoly on communication, there's no way to rebuild it, right? And so the nice thing about multiple channels, if people have access, is at least you have an opportunity to now tell your own story. But credibility is going to be, it's very difficult if you're not in government to tell us a credible story about what you would do if you're in government, right? And so those stories almost certainly have to be told around the histories of individuals who are leaders of that party, where you can document things that they have done, like triumphs under a triumph that they've had under adversity, or if like what you care about is the economy, if they've done something that's sort of recordable or relevant in a bank. I mean, people don't. If I've never seen your, if you've been discredited by state media, right? You telling me abstract things about what you would do if you were governing, it's not going to make that much difference. So to the extent that you can make it concrete and real to me, and for most people, you require like a leader you can tell a story about. I don't know if that answers your question, but for most people, the party if it's a party that's been discredited, that's too hard of a sell. But if you bring in a leader who says, look, we all know, or we can easily document that this leader has done these 3 or 4 things that represent what the group of us would do, that's a way to start building it. People are much more convinced by, in those settings, personal stories than they are by diffuse sort of collective stories. I don't know if that answers your question.
Thank you. So I hope you enjoy the rest of the day.
session.